Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We've been studying Tao Te Ching, and it has been an amazing experience. I want to do the same thing for the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. So we're going to be reading these three texts in parallel. Our focus is going to be to just focus on each of the texts, try to understand it as best as we can, to try to discuss it as deep a level as we can. And slowly patterns will emerge over the weeks about the similarities and differences between these. And I think it's going to produce something magnificent. So I'm really looking forward to it. So today we are starting our reading of the Gospel of John. We're going to start with chapter 1. The format is we're first going to read the entire chapter a couple of times, a couple of different versions, and then we will start discussing it. We'll read parts of it, and then we will discuss it. All right?
First chapter. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming to the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, "This was he of whom I have said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, I think this is the deepest part of the entire book, entire Gospel of John. So I now welcome anybody who wants to talk about what this is saying. If you can explain, anybody who wants, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. Pegor, you want to start?
Sure, I can start. What I want to say is especially the first 5 verses are sort of, I would say, a restatement of this Genesis story. They're like a, obviously, very shortened version of it, but they're a restatement of the Genesis story. And so the book is sort of, John, or the author, is going all the way back to the beginning and sort of tying everything back to the start. Tying everything from the start to where we are now and to continue the story. Because ultimately, in terms of the biblical narrative, Jesus is here to restore the fall of Adam and Eve. So from the story arc, it's like Adam and Eve were the first humans. They were sort of in the garden, they fall into death. And now we have Jesus who is flipping death on its head. with the crucifixion later on. And so that's why I think that this part is there to sort of hint back at the beginning of the story.
Thank you, Pegor. Next up is Carl, David Edelson, Evanik, and David Norton. Carl.
Mute. Hello. Yes, I'd like to add on to what Pegor is saying, and totally agree with all that. It's really fascinating. It's a very direct parallel to Genesis, and it says, "In the beginning was the Word," and the word is kind of in that. The word for that, I believe, is logos in the Greek, and that is truth. And it's interesting because it says the truth, or the word was with God, and then it says, and the word was God. So it's interesting that it makes that jump. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So it's basically saying, making a parallel to, or saying that Jesus is the ultimate truth, and that was also, he was there right at the creation of the world somehow. So it's very fascinating concept, and the way a lot of these concepts are just all pulled together in a very compact way. It could take a very long time to unpack it.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome back. Nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Next up is going to be David.
Yes, thanks, Shrikant. I'm going to try to be a little bit of my best imitation of Jason here, so that unless we have another Greek expert here. I mean, I don't speak Greek, but I was actually studying up on this first line, which I think is somewhat controversial in the Greek. As best, I mean, again, I don't speak Greek or ancient Greek as was written at the time, but the best that I understand is this actually says, sorry if I'm mangling this, but theos and logos. So it's basically saying God, theos, God is in the word. I mean, it's normally translated incorrectly as the word was God, or the word was a God. And this is actually apparently, and I don't want to get into the whole issues about Jehovah's Witnesses who are argued this for sort of other reasons in the English, but in the Greek, apparently, and it's somewhat ambiguous in the actual grammar. I just thought I'd raise this for people's interest. Again, I'm not an expert in Greek, but apparently this is in as a state of being. It's the predicate nominative state. It's not a transitive verb, it's a nominative verb. And in the Greek, at least at that time, there is ambiguity about how one interprets the indefinite article or definite article. So in other words, the statement in the Greek was theos and o logos. It wasn't o theos and o logos. It wasn't the God in the word. It was theos. And apparently in this predicate nominative form, the lack of an article there is ambiguous. So in some cases, when in the Greek, one would actually, normally it's like, the camera or whatever, and for names, you would say the for a name. But the fact that there is no definite article here, it doesn't mean that it's exactly indefinite. It doesn't have to be indefinite. And because it's predicate nominative, it actually is ambiguous whether it is a definite article or an indefinite article. So I just find that interesting, in that actual Greek basis for, again, some of the arguments that the Jehovah's Witnesses get into, but this basically could be translated correctly as either the word was God or the word was a God. And so that's the start of this entire journey and the entire complexity of the Greek here. And again, it's perfectly correct and perfectly reasonable and makes a lot of sense for it to be translated as the word was God, not a God. Definitely is correct that way. But the original Greek has that ambiguity in it, which is, I find, interesting.
Thank you. Next up is Evanique, David Norton, Joe, Brian, Ocean, Margarita, and Claudio. Evanique.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in addition to what Pegor and everybody else said, I just wanted to add that the beginning of this book sets up who Jesus is. And it's a very Western approach in that it's kind of like proving this is who he is. And they prove it through John the Baptist. And then John the Baptist tells you he's the person that's going to announce who the Messiah is. At the time, John doesn't know who he is, but it's kind of like, I'll know him when I see him. And they're like, okay, but you're not Elijah, you're not this, you're not that, right? But then when he comes, John immediately knows who he is. And then John announces who he is. And then John is like, well, this is why Jesus is who he is. And there's proof. And, John talks about how the dove from the heaven, the spirit, came onto Jesus. And so everything in this book, which is a very Western thing to do, is to prove it. And so they spend the entire first chapter pretty much proving it. And then Jesus later on, which I assume we're going to talk about, but I'm not going to go too much in, starts his ministry. It's not like in synoptic gospels where they talk about the history of Jesus in his childhood. John just jumps right in. Like, he starts off as an adult, like, okay, that's great, but let me just tell you who this guy is. And this is how he was the one true, he was the Messiah, which is what the Jewish people were really looking for all this time. But Jesus didn't appear as they expected him to appear. They didn't think he was going to be a Nazarene. They thought this was going to be some great king, and he was going to be rich, and he was going to be powerful, and he was going to save them all from their oppression from the Roman Empire. And so this is John saying who he is. And if you notice, and I'll stop, once John says who he is, it's like, it's none of those things. He is a very powerful person from the inside, which is a very Eastern thing, which is also very interesting, is that it's an Eastern, John describes an Eastern concept of who he is. He's generous. He's the light bringer. All these different descriptors to use for Jesus, not one of them has to do with money or power in a Western sense, but he proves it in a Western sense. That way people get it, if that makes sense.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is David Norton, followed by Joe. David.
Yeah, to me, this whole little part here says an awful lot in many, many different ways. First of all, I'd just like to take and address what this young lady said before me regarding the introduction to Jesus as being the prophet. I think it's very important to understand where that comes from. And that actually comes from Deuteronomy in chapter 17, where it says that everybody's, once they become realizing about God and everything, they're to place a king, sort of say, above them to learn from. Okay, and that's why, they put the sign above Jesus, after he was crucified, the King of the Jews. But the very next chapter, in chapter 18, verse 18 of Deuteronomy, it goes on to say the prophet, as to what that prophet is going to be. And God is talking to Moses, and he says, I'm going to raise up a prophet like unto you, and I'm going to put my words into his mouth. Okay, now this is the context of where these people are getting the idea that Jesus is this prophet from God, because it was prophesied actually through Moses, and continuously in here it talks about Moses, and Jesus even says further on down the line that if you don't believe in Moses, there's no way you can believe in me. But getting back to the beginning of the first actually words that were spoken, which says in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning, the Word was with God, and then the Word became God. To me, there's no doubt that this here goes back to the Genesis story. And the thing is, my personal beliefs is in the Genesis story, What God is doing is creating a communication system for people to live by. Because the thing is, whoever wrote, or it never was written. The thing is, this was all created from narrations, from verbal translations from one to another until Moses came along. And then Moses is the one that gathered all this information from, the people that came before him and sort of put it into a book. And the thing is, inside of that Genesis story, what it does say is that God gave mankind, which they refer to Adam, which means mankind in Hebrew, okay, the responsibility to name everything according to its kind. Okay, so Adam and also mankind, it's our responsibility to identify everything according to the event that it creates. And in many ways, most of the words that we have are created in that way. Now, the thing is, if you take and look at God and the definition of God, okay, the word God is sort of separate, but in the Old Testament, where the word Lord is used, it means Jehovah. And Jehovah means existing, okay, that God is existing. So to me, I relate this to God's existence is within all of the substance of everything that exists in life. So when we're talking about God, we're talking about everything that could ever possibly be. Now, the thing is, his instructions to mankind was to actually take and identify things according to its kind. And what happens in our life, we end up taking and altering those definitions. Now, when we alter those definitions, what we do in turn is create an evil within our lives, because we then become believing in something that's not real. And once again, if you go back to the beginning of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, the thing is, that shows the reality of truth. Okay, because truth begins with the identity of the event of the word. So the thing is, when you think of a word, do we remember it by what somebody else just repeated it to us, or do we actually see its event as to what it actually is doing? And when we can see the event, we see truth.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to add on to what was just the past everyone actually up to this point, but I agree. I mean, this is relating back to Genesis, and that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I also think it's also referencing back to Proverbs as well. From everlasting I was established from the beginning before the earth began. So this is a fulfillment of the prophecy. And I see this as, I do find it interesting in the sense that I agree it's a form of communication, and you're also starting to add a name to things, and everything is coming from man, not necessarily just from nature any longer. So that is a really big distinction, that the world begins with man. Man and God are one, which is a clear delineation from anything that has come before it. There have been prophets, but other than this, this is a clear breaking away of God himself. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. It's really not.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
So it's been a lot has been said, and it's all good. In terms of approach, I think I kind of like David's approach, where we really stick to the text and some of the interesting points there. Several people have said that this parallels or summarizes the Genesis story, the first five verses, and that's true. It definitely covers the same topic, which is the beginning. There's nothing in the first 5 verses about creating heaven and earth. But more importantly, so it could be even more cosmic, if you will. It's an even more cosmic, if I can use that term, view. But there is a big difference, and in my mind, and then it says, in the beginning, in the Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that could be included in what was said here in the first 5 verses of John, but it's much more focused on heavens and earth. But more importantly, in the beginning, God already existed. There was already a God. And God created the heaven and earth. God did it by speaking it into existence. So there was a beginning that already had God, and then God spoke words. Here in John, that's the Genesis. Here in John, there is no God before the Word. The God is the Word, and the Word is God. So there's kind of a big difference that God exists apart from words, and he had creation words. He also had words, for example, that he used to create the law, and words that were spoken by the prophets. There were a lot of words that God spoke in the kind of the Hebrew or Jewish tradition. And here I think we're starting to see some of the Greek traditions integrated into the Jesus story. And I think that's part of the thrust of the whole Gospel of John. There's a lot of Greek concepts. I'll use the word Greek, but then I want to qualify that. There are Greek concepts in this, Greek views, which really are not the same as the Hebrew views that are set forth in the Old Testament. Just as for example, in the other gospel, I think it's I'd have to look back, Matthew or Mark, there's a very long genealogy about Jesus, what's his family background, and that came mostly, I think, the purpose of that was to prove in a Jewish sense, or traditional Jewish sense, that he was, or at least could be, the Messiah. There's nothing of that in John, because there's no concern about establishing that through any of his worldly existence that he was the Messiah. In fact, John is telling us here that he was the Messiah from the beginning of time. And that's also a very important distinction. If you go through the other Gospels, there are different points in time that assert that this person of Jesus became the Messiah. And in John, it's at the beginning of time. For others, it's when he was born, when he was baptized, or when he was crucified. So through events in his life, which is a bit more of I think, a Jewish approach. I apologize for really oversimplifying, but I guess the thrust of it is that there really is, I think, a big difference between this gospel and the Old Testament, and even this gospel and some of the other gospels, and that this is including many Greek ideas. And let me just, one last thing to qualify. Sure. I use the word Greek. This world was very Hellenistic. It had already, Alexander the Great had passed through. The Ptolemaic Empire had come and gone. Now we had the Romans. This is when Jesus was born, was a relatively modern time. And already at the Greek time and before Greek time, people would think in terms of nationalities and national identities but it's really all very, very cosmopolitan. Even these things I've referred to as Greek are ideas that come from many, many different traditions and places.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Ocean, Margarita, Claudio, JJ, Pegor, and Joe. Ocean, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I have nothing to say, except I have a question which would invite everybody who would like to say. I'm a person who comes from the belief, conviction that, you know, between men and women, we're all equal. I don't think men are superior to a woman.
What we will
However,
do, Ocean,
yeah.
just state your questions. We'll take questions towards the end.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Yeah, I have a, well, I think that all versions, they use the word he instead of she, as
Got it.
if God was the male, not
Sure.
female, and
Sure.
so that sort of insinuates that you know, God is a man and superior to a female, and that's, you know, how traditionally women have been treated by men, and I
Sure.
have a little problem with that.
Sure. Understand.
yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Margarita, Claudio, and JJ. Margarita.
Yes, hello. It's interesting discussion, isn't it, Srikanth?
Yes.
What I want to share is more about how I see myself reading this text. So in terms of literary style, I think John, whoever John write this chapter, is quite interesting because he can put dramatic component in it. So when I read the first 5 verses, it's more like poetic, interesting. I want to see it further. And in this chapter is quite unique because there's this plot. It's not just here. At the end, chapter 21, if I'm not mistaken, even there's the second part that returned to the, so after Jesus died and raised back, alive again. And then suddenly it goes back to the Last Supper. So when Peter asks, who will betray you, God? But that's already in the past. So this is a way probably John wants to engage the reader. So it becomes really interesting. It's quite interesting, I think, for the text about 2,000 years old. And secondly, I think in reading this, especially in the second part when it starts to be narrative, no longer poetic in like the first 5 verses, I see Jesus start to raise question about whether do you believe that? For the first chapter, you are asked whether you believe or not. That is engaging. That is like making myself in part of the story, as if like I was asked by Jesus, do you believe? And you know what? If you believe, you're going to see many things more. So I think this is a successful start for a narrative that makes people want to read further because you kind of being questioned, do you believe? And if you want to believe, you can read more because there are many more in the next chapter. So yeah, that's for my.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. Next up is going to be Claudio, JJ, and Pegor. Claudio.
Yeah, I found the first 2 verses most interesting. I agree with Pegor, David, and Joseph that it's the same as in Genesis when in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth. So he's like the first cause in both chapters, right? He stands alone. He's not contingent at anything. And the Word, he is the Word. The Word was with God, and Word was God. But it's not just any word, mind you. It's not like the words that we use, which have limited power in the temporal world, and they're imperfect. God's Word is supernatural. It contains like all the ingredients of creating the universe, and a universe that is ordered and that reflects his nature. So it's not just ordinary word. And one thing, I just can't help it, if I may, it reminded me of the Tao Te Ching, chapter 25, when they were referring, let me read it. There is a thing formed in chaos existing before heaven and earth, silent and solitary, it stands alone. So it makes me wonder, if they're referring to the same thing. I don't know. Just makes me wonder. So I find that very interesting, the similarities that both entities, like they're both the first cause and they stand alone. They're self-sufficient and they're self-existent as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudio. Next up is going to be JJ, followed by Rogine. JJ.
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Shrikant.
Hi.
The way I see it, after hearing several people talk, is that in Genesis, there is the light that creates the world, the universe. The sun is created actually later, and I think sometimes people see that as a contradiction, but when it says, let there be light, and creation starts, and then at the end, it was good. It's matter, it's the world being created, it's a physical light. So it's the beginning of the universe, and Christ being the Word in the sense of the Father, the Creator, the Father Creator, speaking out this word, so let there be light. So he's creating the world through Jesus Christ, he being the Word. So in the New Testament, with John saying that Christ is the light, and this mentions about the light, we're now talking about the inner light coming into this first light that created the world and the physical world. So now it's the opening up to the inner world, the world of the mind and the spirit. And so that's how I interpret this new light in the New Testament.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Rogine, followed by Pegor and Joe. Rogine.
Yeah, hi. I did study Greek for quite a while, Koinonia Greek. I think the New Testament was written in Koinonia Greek, which is different than classical and very different than modern or even semi-modern Greek. So we can't be quite sure what this means. In fact, trying to speak Koinonia Greek to modern Greeks, they just laugh hysterically. But I see this gospel as it exists, intending to be devotional, kind of like the Psalms are. We do know that monks during the so-called Dark Ages were the copiers of these texts and the ones that preserved it. And it's entirely possible that a pious monk with the whole theology of Christianity as it evolved, whatever you believe about that, added the more poetic, especially the first parts. And it seems to me that if it were like a contemporary of Jesus writing, they wouldn't have needed to go into Genesis in such a poetic way. So I think parts of John are beautiful and maybe like Genesis, where there are two stories of the creation, that this gospel is meant to speak to your heart, not your mind.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rogine. It was great. Next up is Pegor, followed by Joe. Pegor.
Yeah, what I wanted to talk about, since there's a lot of conversation around like the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I think this is sort of setting up the Trinity, or the concept of the Trinity, where you have, because even Peterson has talked about this, that the Word or Logos is Jesus Christ, and then that God the Father used God the Son, the Logos, to create the world. So you're seeing these So we have these two different words. You have the word and the God, and they seem to be, they are different entities or different things, but we sort of equate, the text is equating them. And I think this is sort of setting up the Trinity. And later on in the chapter, we also see the mention of the Holy Spirit. And so the Trinity is sort of complete in that sense. And I think that's what this word God kind of thing is. It's hinting at or indicating that you have God the Father, and then you have God the Son, the Word, because there's this like equation or equality between the word with a capital W and Jesus.
So that's a profound point. And what we're going to do is that we're going to have Joe and Regine comment, and then we are going to focus on parts of it. I would just now focus, next we are going to just focus on the first five lines, because I want to dig deep into that. And I think what you're saying goes to the heart of the meaning of the first five. Also, JJ pointed, similarly to that in a different way. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Regine. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, just to build a little bit on what Bagor was saying, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who come from the Father, full of grace and truth. I agree is that you kind of see some of these, the idea of the Trinity being set up here. And actually, this is one of the things that we covered during the Bible series, God the Father, God the Son, God the Almighty, and these archetypes, and they're kind of being combined into one. So it seems, that if you read into that you're talking about the Word becoming flesh as well, you're starting to see the transition of God the Father, becoming God the Son, and then what is his redemption? Right? How does he redeem the rest of us? So you can see the process starting to begin here very clearly. If you go back to looking at the Peterson series, that's a very clear distinction he makes in his very first lecture of, the archetypes that are existing, God the Father, God the Son. So I think that this is pretty interesting in that regard, that you can see the archetypes starting to manifest themselves in these paragraphs. That's something new to me as well, because I was not as familiar with, after initially I read the Bible many times years ago, you're not really looking at it from a archetype type of perspective. So when you start to see that and add that layer to it, it provides you with a different kind of context, and you can kind of see it flow differently. It's interesting.
Thank you, Joe. That was a fantastic point, and that's what we'll focus on when we look at just the first paragraph here. But Regine, you had a comment on this point?
Yeah, it's also true that during the time of Jesus, and actually for hundreds of years before and some after, there were other teachers collecting disciples and wandering around, claiming to be the Messiah and doing miracles. So the beginning of John needs to establish why this one really is the Messiah.
Wonderful. Thank you. So what let's do now, let's do one thing. This is actually very, very deep. So I want to go one level deeper now by not going further, not looking at larger parts, but looking at a smaller part, just the first paragraph. So first 5 lines. Now I owe a lot to a friend with whom I've had a very long conversations about this. So most of what I'm saying will come from what I learned from him. So it is, and I'm not familiar with this, but I was completely blown away by this first paragraph. And you have to, the way he put it is that you have to understand 2 concepts in order to understand this first paragraph. One is the concept that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man. That's one concept. The second concept is that of Trinity, that God is one and God is three at the same time. And that's what explains this entire paragraph and what follows. So word refers to the Christ. So in the beginning was the word, and it is Trinity. It's God in all three forms was there in the beginning. But the first sentence says that Christ was there in the beginning. The second sentence, the word was with God. So Christ was with God. So the Son was with the Father. And the word was God. So Christ is God. So that is the concept of Trinity, that in the beginning, Christ was there, the Christ was with God, and Christ was God. So that's the first. He was in the beginning with God. So again, in the beginning, both the two parts of Trinity are there at the same time. All things were made through him. He's the connection between God and reality. So all things are made through him because he is God and man at the same time. So godly and earthly at the same time. All things were made through him, and without him, not anything made that was made. So all of creation requires both those things. In him was life, and the life was light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. But I see that core idea that Jesus being God and man and the Trinity as the starting point of this. So any thoughts, any comments, just on any comments that you have, not about what I said, but about what is in the first paragraph. Okay, it's going to be David, Norton, Carl, and Mike. David.
Okay, we're unmuted now. Well, I don't know, hearing your understanding of it, I wish I could give you a whole background of my understanding of this whole thing. But without question, to me, the way you went through it and everything, it was a personification of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, period. Okay, and the background of my understanding, the way I've focused on this the past 35 years is not in that way. Because of the fact that the name for God, okay, they call him God in the Old Testament, but they also use the word Lord. And when the word Lord is used, it's identifying God as existence. And it doesn't personify him at all. But the thing is, it opens God up to being everything, the universe, the plants, the substance from the ground, the water, and everything. But when you personify him, automatically you're putting up borders as to putting that God inside this box. And I don't relate to the content of the first 5 sentences of John in that way. But I do look at a lot of variables to me that are on the outside of that, of which was mentioned before. I think the Greek culture had a lot to do with the way his presentation is, and also even the book of John written, because it's over and over and over, it's said that this book was written by somebody that was very, very close to him, that loved him passionately. So therefore, there's an intimacy within side of the context, almost of every single word that exists in the Gospel of John. And, like I say, to me, even though that person had a personal relationship and recognized Jesus as a person, to me, he was far, far more than that, and took in the context of everything from the beginning, until who knows when, into the future, in his words and everything that he did, because he did everything that was expected of him. And I see it all expressed in a common sense way too. but not as a person. I mean, even though he was a person that walked this earth, the thing is, his projections are not in a personification way. They're meant for everything. They're applicable in every sense of the way that you possibly could do it, you know. So that's my words.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate this. I mean, there is so many interpretations here. There is a take which is fundamentally from the Old Testament and New Testament. There is a difference in spirit in both of those, which is very fundamental. And all of this we are here to discuss. So really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
I'd like to say one more thing. Could I say one more thing?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing is, one thing I think that is really important to keep in mind when you're reading and understanding the Gospels and also the Old Testament is that Jesus, it is said in chapter 13 of Matthew, that Jesus never spoke without speaking a parable. And the thing is, if we could take and put the content of this whole Old Testament and the New Testament as a parable, it really allows everybody to have their own relationship and God to talk them in their own way, in which you're going to get a feed and an understanding coming from everyone else, everyone, to see something different.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. Next up is Carl, followed by Mike. Carl.
I think what you said about the Trinity really pulls this passage together, and about Jesus being 100% God and 100% man. I just want to take a small step backwards. Doesn't contradict with that, but say someone's coming to this, like the concept of the Trinity came about by reading the Bible and then extracting that idea out. There's no place in the Bible, maybe someone's going to argue with me now, but there's no place that super obviously states that the exact Trinitarian idea. At least in my, I read a lot many years ago and never came across anything super obvious. But just look at, say a person didn't know the concept of the Trinity, I just think there's a beautiful tension that's intentional, right, in that first verse or two. And it says, like, in the beginning was the Word, and it's kind of implied that the Word is Jesus, and that the Word was with God. So it's like the Word is with God, and then it says the Word was God. You know, and if someone's like a purely logical person, it's like, well, there's a contradiction. You said two lines and you're already contradicting yourself. And then there's an intentional breaking of that tension again. So he was in the beginning with God. So it's like, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, he was in the beginning with God. And then the parallel to Genesis, all things came into being through him. So I think it's just, I think it's fascinating, the tension that was set up there, and it's a tension in a beautiful way. So it's interesting.
Thank you, Carl. Next up is Mike, followed by Margarita, Joe, Kevin, and Rogine. Mike.
Okay, the issues here are one of multiple paradoxes versus dualism. He talks about light and darkness. He talks about how he had the basis of this was in Isaiah, this was in Genesis, this was in Moses talking to the burning bush. How am I going to, who should I say sent me? Now, the ultimate paradox here is faith versus knowledge as to what you should believe. And several people, particularly Rogine, said there's many people throughout the ages, from Moses in the desert to Jim Jones in recent history, and there's 8 more people in the New York Times this year who've come out and said they're messiahs and they're here to save the world. He had to set the predicate for who sent me and why I'm here. Now, he did it without saying who sent me and why I'm here, but he had to set that predicate. And the concept of the Trinity didn't come out until the Second Council of Nicaea, 800 years later. The fact that and the fact that God that he was God, or just the Son of God, or just a Messiah is treated in different or just a prophet here to set a stage was treated in each of the Gospels. Now, John is very different than the other Gospels. Now, I also should say there's not just the 4 Gospels, not just the 5 Gospels, not just the 45 Gospels. There's about 5,000 which are studied as predicates for where these all came from and from different scrolls. So there's a lot that we need to further describe here
Thank you.
of the difference between dualism and paradox. And there's many things on both sides of that issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Margarita, followed by Joe. Margarita.
Yes, thank you. If I read those first 5 verses, I think it should be something striking, because I think this chapter is written in the late 1st century, where probably the Christians or people who follow Jesus start to be excommunicated from the synagogue. And I think at that time also the Gnostic, so the different interpretation about who is Jesus, whether he is a human or he is God, or how many percent of his human side and how many percent as God. So there are many stories probably about Jesus and who he was. So probably this chapter aimed to target that, to say, so this is God. And I think he already stated that in chapter 20, if I'm not mistaken, that the reason why this is written is so you believe. So in a way, I think this first 5 verses is like more propaganda to make sure that you understand that Jesus is God and he's alive and he's the Son of God, something like that.
Thank you, Margarita. Next up is Joe, followed by Kevin. Joe.
Yeah, this is surpassing expectations as a meetup. This is very good. One of the things that I want to maybe call attention to is saying what God isn't anymore. And what God isn't is nature. So that's a really important distinction to make. And this idea of truth as well, and the light, is something that I make is kind of a link between how do you know what is good and how do you know what is evil, right? So then the darkness is the absence of light. So that is the truth. So that's true in classical philosophy. So you start to have this, it starts to be a setup of the rest of what is the way and what isn't. And it's using man and God and flesh as opposed to in the word, the spoken word, as opposed to nature and its rules and its laws. So I think that's a very important point, because if you look at the archetype of even God the Father, there's a big distinction. God the Father is not nature. That's one of the characteristics of that particular archetype. So, and God the Father also, there comes a lot with that. Is when you have the Father, there also comes things like punishment, what is right, what is wrong. We can get into all that later, but this is the basis for all that. Anyway.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Kevin, followed by Rogine. And then Alicia, you had a great comment. So after Rogine, if you could comment on that. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Suyanka. If remember, you mentioned that the thing is your favorite one chapter is 25.
Yes.
Claudio also mentioned 25. that's great. I would put here. Yeah, I agree with you guys. And here for me, what is the word? Maybe you guys have better meaning from, for me, it's for here, it's like from mathematical entity relationship. The two entities from the text is one is the word, another is God. God, a word with God is the relationship kind. Also was God, word was God is entity, the same. Here in the Tao said, there's something it's wonderful. I don't know the name. I give a name called Tao. For this case, if I put this Tao way, let's see, Tao is the word. Word is God. God is Jesus or John. The Jesus is yourself. And here, let's say if we follow chapter 25, the last they see the translated to English is a man follows the way of the earth. Earth follows the way of the heaven or sky. The sky or sky follow the ways of a Tao. Tao follows own ways. So our word language itself betrays us, maybe we talk about the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Regine, Alicia, Brian, and Evanique. Regine.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I hadn't really thought about what it shows what God isn't. What I was going to say is I think this invites the reader to think about God in the Hebrew context as bigger and more magical than the giver of laws, and makes the Son very different than Moses or the other Old Testament characters who were called by God and spoken to by God and had to receive all these rules from God. And this is very different, much more awe-inspiring. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Regine. Alicia, would you like to speak out the comments that you made about? You don't need to. If you want to, just go ahead and unmute. All right. Next up is Brian, followed by Evanique. Brian.
Well, I like the comments that Kevin made. And Regine, I have kind of three different thoughts here, but the first one goes to what they're saying, most squarely what they're saying. And that is these first 5 verses are suggesting that Jesus is both transcendent and immanent. So he's concrete, particular, present in the here and now, but he's also universal, ideal. And other concepts of the transcendent. And so it's, but then he goes on, and this is the what Michael's talking about, the paradox, is that he's both. And that's suggested in some of the inconsistencies that have been flagged. So in the Tao, and that's why I like Kevin's, is the Tao is both immanent and could be characterized as more immanent and transcendent at the same time. I think there is some difference between the Tao and this concept of the Messiah, but again, I think the Messiah immanent and transcendent. The difference is I think the Tao is involved in a process. The Tao is considered as a process of immanent things, whereas the kind of transcendence that's being suggested here is more of a Platonic type of transcendence, where there's an ideal world as opposed to the material world. The couple other observations are, number one, both, I want to talk about the Jewish and Greek traditions here. And I use those words, again, kind of as just as handles, because I think both of them are really more cosmopolitan in origin. And really, if you look at them in nature, but they're two different traditions. And it's interesting that both of these traditions, the Hebrew and the Greek, try to justify their position by explaining the origin of things. And I'm not sure that's a very modern approach anymore. I'm not sure we're into origins to the extent they are. We're more into sources. What's the source of energy here and now, as opposed to the origin way back when that nobody really knows about. And then the last thought I had was a lot of the comments people have been making have been going, and I think that kind of distinguishes a bit some of the comments that have been made, Rogine and Kevin, they're not reflecting so much on the history and traditions embodied in this text, but on kind of what it says to them. Also, David has done that, others have done that, but a lot of people here have been, and me too, are very much caught up in the history and traditions embodied in these texts. And that's partly because in the Hebrew traditions are all about Hebrew texts are all about history and tradition. And we're a little bit caught up in that. It's not so much just idealistic speculation about the here and now. It's more about what happened back then and what does that mean?
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Evanik, followed by Margarita. Evanik.
Yeah, so some of the thoughts I've been having as been listening is I think Joe's comment about God not being nature, I think is very true because God created nature according to this text. It says everything was in verses 3-5. It says everything was created through him. Nothing, not one thing, came into being without him. So when you see that, in a sense, it's right that God is not nature because God created nature. Nature is a creation of God, but in a sense, God had to put himself in it. Like you always put a little bit of yourself in your creation. And so God had to put himself in the creation. And I was thinking of creation and Jordan Peterson talking about order and chaos, masculine and feminine. And I think when you say God is creation and creation is kind of chaos, right? I think of it as creation is chaos plus order because it's the darkness and it's just out of sorts and God gets order to it by speaking word. Even word is a creation of God because it says God is the word, but God has to speak creation into existence in a sense. So I just thought that was just interesting. One thing about comparison with the Tao and and John, I think there are similarities and differences. I think one of the things I wanted to point out is that I think if you were to compare them, Tao is God, and Tao is equal to God from the Tao Te Ching and the Bible. But I think Jesus is the Messiah and the sage. There's a lot of qualities of the sage that Jesus has. So I think Jesus is the sage. Now, the question that I have is, does the sage come from God? Is the sage equal to God? So it's just an interesting question that I have that I want to study out. But and then the last part where we were talking about the Jewish and the Greek, I think one of the things to understand is that that the Jewish culture at that time was part of the Roman Empire. And so they were kind of like underneath the Romans or the Greek. So there was a almost like a culture clash in a sense, and that God was seen, or the Messiah was to be seen as to save them from the Roman Empire, or to save them from anybody that's really suppressing them or seen as suppressing them. So, but what Jesus actually did, and I'll stop here because I think it goes a little further. Well, Jesus didn't really care about that. Like, he didn't care that the Roman Empire, that they were under the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, he associated with Romans, he associated with pagans, and that's one of the things that got him in deep trouble. So I think there's those two cultures that are coming into conflict with each other, where they're almost like at war with each other. And Jesus is like meant to be seen as the savior, and he's not saving them from that. In a sense, he's saving the Jewish people from themselves. So it's just a very interesting coming attractions, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanik. Next up is Margarita, Joe. Margarita and Joe. Margarita.
Yes, I think from this first 5 verse, it's clearly stated about what is God and what is not God. However, even though we try to understand it, it's not easy. I think also in the next chapter, we see every time Jesus put up the signs, the miracles, he will be rejected. He will be denied, even chased to be killed. So I think this is also a good reflection for me, even though there is this description about what God is and what is not, like Joe said, but it's not easy to chew sometimes. We reject that idea sometimes, and this is the process of understanding God, probably.
Thank you, Margarita. Next up is Joe.
So, yes, the one thing that actually Evanik had brought up, and I think I may have even read this part, is the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, if we take the idea of the spoken word and the idea of that being truth, then you can really extract from that the idea of bringing order to chaos through the spoken truth. And that's a very profound concept, because then you're starting to say what is true and what is false. And that is saying what is potential is now becoming ordered and is becoming, the distinction between chaos and order. So this is what now these words are bringing order to all the potential in the world. And that's setting up everything for literally the universe. So I think that this is a profound concept and importance when we're talking about this particular part.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Great, amazing point. I'm going to go to the next paragraph. So it's going to be from 6 to 8. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. So John is the harbinger. What is the role of John? So any thoughts about just these lines? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Evanik.
Yeah, so this is John the Baptist. Now, one of the things that John doesn't go into, but the other gospels go into, is how John's mother and Elizabeth, John's mother, and Mary, the mother of God, come to me in the synagogue. And as soon as Elizabeth sees Mary, she says that John leaps in her belly, because John kind of has this connection to him. So for that to be set up and to go here and say that John is the messenger, you see that was set up before he was born. And in a sense, it's kind of like, it's odd to me because it's almost magical and mystical, right? And usually, generally, Christianity is not like typical magical. Like, this is a very unusual phenomenon in Christianity, talking about the leaping of, like, the sense that John the Baptist knows Jesus from before he was born. But in this verse, he talks about he's the announcer. So he's the person that is setting everyone up. He's also telling everyone about this, about who Jesus is, and getting everybody, like, he's the hype man, I think. I think the good way to describe is John in modern day terms is that he is the hype man for Jesus. Like, he is the person that's telling them, like, the Messiah is coming, get yourselves ready, get yourselves pure, stop doing the things that you're doing that is against the law. He's coming, get yourself ready, get yourself prepared. That way you can receive him and you can receive salvation. He's the hype man. So I think it's very interesting. And I wish, even though John doesn't go into it, I wish he kind of did a little bit. That way you could get a little more context of how John knows that this is Jesus. And it's just this feeling. And so I'll stop because then I'm going to go ahead of myself. But
Thank you, Evanik. Next up is David, Norton, Rogine, and Claudio. David.
Okay. Well, when I read this, I have to go back to Matthew, where Jesus, before he even came along, it said that his name would be Jesus because he would save his people from their sins. That there's a purpose for Jesus Christ to come into this world. Now, and the thing is, there's no doubt in my mind that John knew this, okay? And John, talking to everybody and really putting out the word that Jesus was the person, okay? He was a witness for Jesus Christ, pointing people to go to Jesus Christ. Now, the way I look at my relationship with Jesus, the only thing that I can ever do, because to me, I could never be Jesus, is to take and, number one, give testimony of him, just like John gave testimony in his own way of Jesus Christ. So the thing is, then I become a student and I become a brother through learning from Jesus. So, to me, that there is what I see in this particular, passage and that particular, all about John, period. Because the thing is, when God comes alive in our life, all of a sudden, he's there, and we can't do it to other people and make God come alive in their lives. But the only thing we can do is give testimony, and then it becomes up to Jesus or God to take and speak the right word, to take and come alive in the person's life that may be around us or that we're giving testimony to. And to me, this happens every weekend in the churches, because a preacher can be up there taking and saying a word, and they may be thinking a word coming out of their mouth. But the thing is, the people that's in the audience that's receiving those words will receive something very different, and oftentimes something directly from God through that preacher, even though he's up there doing his job, but he really don't know what he's doing as far as them receiving what's going on. So that's the way I look at John. He was a terrific guy. The name is wonderful and very appropriate for this book.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Great observations. Thank you. Next up is Rogine, followed by Claudio. Rogine.
I'm a little mystified by the John the Baptist stuff. I really, really wish we had some indication of what John was saying that would get people to come and get baptized, saying, in addition to watch for the Messiah, because there was nothing all that special about watch for the Messiah. And I guess to me, it kind of means, well, if you can't quite accept all that's coming later, you kind of need your own John the Baptist. and kind of get ready for this. But I really wish we knew what he was teaching.
Thank you. Next up is Claudio.
Yeah, I guess the word light refers to Jesus, and John is the witness. I guess he's trying to get people to follow Jesus in order to be saved. But this implies that the fact that the light, I guess it implies perhaps, maybe, I'm not sure, that people were living in darkness. So you needed the light to see the truth. I don't know what, maybe people were worshiping false gods, or maybe focusing too much on the law of the Torah. So he's introducing kind of like a new ideology here, kind of like, a sect from Judaism, right? A branch, something new. But I don't know if that's accurate or not, if that's what light actually refers to. Some maybe perhaps linked to salvation, or to see the truth, or the kingdom of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Next up is Brian.
So since Rogine asked, I'll share what I've read about what John was teaching. It's not really in the text, so I don't know. I'll try to be brief about it.
Yeah, let's be brief because we want to go through as much of the text as possible, but go ahead.
Most people believe that John was an Essene, which was a different school of Jewish thought, opposed from the Sadducees, who were the high priests, and the Pharisees, who were bound to the book. The Essenes believed in following ritual purity and separated themselves from the big cities. They lived on the east side of the Jordan. That's where John did his baptizing. And the baptizing was a ritual purity. It was also an initiation act, an initiation ritual. But he focused on the ritual purity and ritual purity acts and preserving that purity. The thing, I only mention that because, again, these writers point out, he wasn't just pointing, that Jesus was somewhat different in the teaching, in that Jesus didn't put the focus on ritual purity, but on being kind to the poor. It was he had a different thrust in his message. There are other differences, but that's, I think, a good key point.
Thank you, Brian. So now we're going to go to the next paragraph, which is 9 through 13. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Who believed in his name, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. Go ahead if you would like to comment. Pegor.
Yeah, I think this perfectly sets up the end, the end of the Jesus story where
Pegor, your sound, if you could move your mic towards your mouth. Okay, now it should be okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was saying that this perfectly sets up the second half of Jesus' story, where he gets betrayed effectively, or sacrificed by the Jews, which are effectively his people. And so this is sort of like you can say this as a literary device. This is foreshadowing.
Sure. Thank you. Pegor, if you could work on your audio, it's really terrible. Thanks. Next up is David. And Pegor, I really like what you comment, and I want to make sure that people can actually hear you. Okay, thank you. David.
Okay. Well, number one, this thing says an awful lot that I don't know that I'll be able to cover it all, but you know, the thing is, let's see. What was the last number of that passage?
9. So the last one is 13. So 9
Okay.
through 13.
Okay, the thing is, to me, and I'm just going to comment maybe on this last one, which he was talking about, which were born not of blood, nor of will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. You know, doing this, to me, Jesus Christ is actually separating and identifying the flesh of man and how people really think, and you know what happens when words get into themselves. Because the first nature of any person is, when we take and use words as things to take and exalt ourselves, to make ourselves happy, to get the things that we want. Okay, but God, in the Spirit of God, is not necessarily operate in that same realm at all. And the thing is, once a person is born of the Spirit, okay, you're no longer looking at the things that are beneficial to yourself, but there's a hunger, a desire to take and seek out the truths of the Spirit, say of God. And as you go further in understanding the things of teachings of Jesus Christ, he actually identifies the Spirit of God. I can't think of it right in my mind right now, but it is located in this Gospel of John, okay, where he literally identifies that Spirit. He identifies the Holy Spirit. Everything Jesus says, this is this. Now, if we can take those things and identify them the way he identifies them and apply them to life, okay, then we no longer are operating in our own realm and for the things that our own flesh and blood desire, but we're really truly operating in the Spirit of say the truths of God that exist, and we can see life in a whole different, they use the word light, but it is very true, a whole different light. I know the thing is, up until a certain point in my life, you know, it wasn't until there was a realization where like I was almost baptized by John the Baptist in a way, to where all of a sudden I'm looking and saying, hey, the words I'm speaking, the things I'm saying is wrong, you know. And, you know, some people call it, you know, I call it actually just uniting with the Spirit of God, recognizing that what you're doing is wrong, and then turning that around and listening to what Jesus says, because he's always asking questions. And I answer those questions myself through his word, so that I can take and sort of understand what he's saying. So it sort of makes that connection to the Spirit that I wasn't born with, and it wasn't part of my flesh, but it's been taught to me through Jesus Christ.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Brian.
I like that, you know, I agree with what, you know, what David said, and how this process works. I think what is being said in this text, it's taking this, what starts out as rather, what I would say, cosmic observations or general observations, and now he's making it personal for individuals. And if I can use the framework I had earlier, the eminent and the transcendent, he's saying that Jesus and Jesus can believing in Jesus can transform the person, and the transformation here is characterized as transformation from just a natural person born of the flesh to someone born of God. So someone who's purely immanent and caught up in material things to a person who can embrace spiritual things.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Jeff.
So my memory about all of these things is not quite so great. I studied these things a great deal about 40 years ago. So it's been a while. But I did study them quite a bit in the Koine Greek. I'm very familiar with what the other Gospels said as well. So in a sort of a direct syntopical understanding here, to just get a little bit of more information on it, especially appreciating that this gospel was written probably by the sort of the John community, sort of the St. John community. And there are a number of kind of, there's gospels and there's letters, and they're considered to be about, I think, if I remember correctly, kind of 4 or 5 major documents that go into the sort of orientation of John. But it was written, it's the last, of the ones that were accepted into the canon, as Mike was saying very well. This was written about 90 to 100, maybe even 110 AD. Mark was the first one, written around 50 AD. So John kind of assumes these other things, doesn't have to really go into them in the same way. It's been said. And but the Greek for John's message was very rich, as recounted in Luke and Matthew. And it's this. Let's see if I can remember how to pronounce the Koine Greek words correctly. It's Metanoia engekengar I basileia ton urunon. Now, Basileia is obviously the kingdom of God is coming. Greek, there's a thought really that Koine Greek was written in thoughts. There really is no good punctuation, and even the order of words, you kind of have to decide based on, there's a lot of ways you can put this together. But Shrikant, I think you'll find this, what I'm about to say, very interesting, because metanoiate, well, meta is really to change, and our word that has meta in it is metamorphosis, which is to transform. But metanoiate doesn't have anything to do with form. Noiate comes from the word for thinking. And so when you look kind of literally at what John was saying, he was saying, change the way you think. In a way, change your function, change the way you think. And for the kingdom of God is at hand. If you were to say that in the 21st century, you might say something like, because a new world order is impinging upon us, the whole world is going to be different. So change the way you think. Metanoiate, engekengar basileia ton urunon, a new kingdom, a new way of, a whole new world. And it's a little bit like that quote from Louis Sullivan, the world was impinging from within and without. I thought you might find that interesting, that
Thank you.
These sound a little similar. And metanoiate is translated generally as repent. And there's a reason for all that, but literally what it means is there's no getting sorry in it. It is change the way you think. And so and then the second thing is that, when it says believing in his name, believe it, those who believe his name. Well, in I think it's in Matthew, it says, he shall be called Savior, because it will save, and the word there, interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, is Yeshua, which if you translate directly from Aramaic to English would be Joshua. It becomes Jesus in the transliteration from Aramaic to Koine Greek to English. So it goes to Yeshua, to Iesus, to Jesus. But if it had come straight from the Aramaic, this would not be Jesus, this would be Joshua, which is the literal name that means Savior. So I'll stop there, and everything I just said could be wrong because it's 40 years ago, but those are some of the things that I recall.
Thank you. I'm glad that things that have been in you for 40 years are finding life and light of the day again. Thank you. Next up is Evanique.
Well, Jeff just pretty much said everything I wanted to say in a way better way than I would have said it.
You were
But
planning to speak Greek too?
Oh, well, no.
Okay.
But everything he wanted to say, because the one thing I wanted to say is that when we were talking about that passage, he says he's always, the phrase that he's always been here. And the phrase also that, you know, he was around, but people did not see him. And I think it's the connection between body and spirit, right? Because if he's been here the whole time, that means he's spiritual and he's been around. And, you know, and it's like connecting to your spirit. If you're not connected to your spirit, then there was no way you were going to see Jesus. And one of the things that we'll see about Jesus is that he really calls out religious hypocrisy. And he really calls out particularly the Pharisees, the Sadducees, he calls them whitewashed tombs. You know, like they look all pretty on the outside, but they're dead on the inside. They're empty tombs. So I think the way Jeff said it is really great. And I think he's absolutely 100% on point. But I think the thing is, the key is that if you're connected to spirit or you're looking for something, Jesus is it. You know, and the way you'll see it throughout the text is that you have to be looking for something. Like in your spirit, you have to be looking for something in order to see him. If you're looking, you'll find them. And I think what John has pointed out in this chapter is that people aren't looking for Jesus. They're really not. They're looking out for themselves. They're looking to be freed from the empire. They're looking to be, you know, they want money. They want the things that they want, but they're not really, it's all material what they want. It's all worldly. It's all part of this world, what they want. If they're truly looking for something past this world, then they'll find Jesus, or Jesus will find them, or they'll connect. So, but I'm going to stop because Jeff just said it so much better than I did.
Thank you, Evanik. It was wonderful. I mean, this conversation is just incredible. Next up is going to be, let's go with Jason, followed by Claudio, David, and Margarita. Jason, go ahead.
All right. I think everyone's been amazingly insightful so far, and I really appreciate everyone's input so far here. I just want to add a few small points. One is the idea of a releasing of the boundaries of who this message is really going out to, right? This is not a tribal message. It's not a message just for certain culture, certain people. In fact, the idea that Jesus, he came to his own and his own did not receive him. Jesus was from the Jewish tribe, the tribe of Israel, and he was not totally rejected, but in large part rejected, because I think, as Evanika alluded to earlier, that he did not fit the idea of what they believed would be a Messiah. So again, I don't want to rehash all of that, but the idea is that this message is, it's not confined to the typical boundaries that many religions tend to be associated with, or even many movements tend to be associated with the group of people that originated from. That's over the ages. It's sort of like me. I'm Indian from a more of a Hindu background. That is Hinduism, even though it is one of the world's oldest religions, it is still essentially associated with people of Indian origin, despite the passage of millennia, really. Whereas Christianity, the message of Christ, from the very beginning, there's even a verse in one of the other gospels where Jesus basically said, okay, I'm actually done with the Jews. So I'm paraphrasing it. He's like, I'm gonna go reach out to the Gentiles, basically the people outside of the Jewish people group. So in fact, and he broke down those boundaries in a big way, because Jews prior to the time of Christ, or even during the time of Christ, were really not supposed to be associating with people outside of these tribes, these Jewish tribes. They were considered unclean people. So Jesus, it was a very big social taboo to be associating, but even associating with these people, but also saying that they can also be a part of God's grand plan as well. That the Jews were no longer the only chosen people. It was now literally the rest of the world could be also chosen people if they were to receive this message. And that brings me to the next point, which is the lack of a significant performative aspect to what Jesus was putting out there, in the sense of the verse here that says, as many received him, that's who had the right to become children of God, to those who believed in his name. And again, this is echoed throughout the New Testament in the sense of there's not a thing you have to do. I mean, they talk about baptism, they talk about certain other things, but none of those, but the first aspect is that of belief, is that of how do you see yourself in light of eternity, in light of God's who God is and who we are, right? So it's what Jeff has referred to as the metanoia. It's, have you had your mind changed at all? So if I were to light a candle and say an incantation, that in and of itself is not satisfying, in a sense, to what God wants from us. Is he wants a change of mind, a change of heart, and the journey will proceed from there. But it begins with a change in your belief rather than a change in action. It's the change in action that's supposed to stem from the new mind, the renewed heart, things like that. So that's what I find the two distinctives in this message so far.
Thank you, Jason. Really like the points that it is across group of people. It's not tied to a group of people, and it is not tied to any kind of a ritual. It is kind of transformation that comes from within and is universal. Excellent points. Next up is Claudio. Claudio, go ahead.
Yes, regarding verses 10 and 11, where God comes into the world that he himself created, according to Genesis, first in his own image, right? Yet the people did not recognize him, although he created them in his own image through him, right? So that kind of sounds like a disappointment or as a surprise or something unusual happening, right? Or reflects the darkness that his people have fallen into. And verse 11 is similar, that they reject him. The people that he brought into existence, right, his own, and they did not receive him not, right? They received them not. So there's a reason for these two verses, maybe to point out the degree that humanity had fallen into darkness, that they don't recognize their own parent and they reject their own parent. If you want to use an analogy of a parent and child, right? A parent brings the child into existence, yet the child does not recognize the parent and also rejects the parent. So how does that make the parent feel, right? Yeah, I just thought there's an analogy there. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. Next up is going to be David, Margarita, and Brian. David.
I hope I'm the David.
Yes, you're the right David. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just wanted to mention that, the thing is, I keep hearing this word about the Greek and everything. To me, definitely there was probably Greeks had the greatest influence upon Jesus, more so than the Hebrew or the Romans, because that there was basically the culture of the land since Alexander had been there. And also the thing is, anybody that's really serious about this, if you don't know about it, you should be aware of a book called Strong's Concordance, because what it does, it allows you to take a word from the Bible and to take it back into this concordance and find out what the original Greek and Hebrew words actually are, okay, and find out the different ways that the Hebrew and also the Greek words are used in the different language or the different meanings in our English language. because often they take one word, like even the word meta, and it's used in several different forms and different words as we speak our English language. So, the thing is, when you taking and studying this, I think it's really important. It's important to me anyway, to find out the original intent of the original word. And it can be found, like I say, with Strong's Concordance. It's online and it's available to anybody. It's very easy to use.
David, could you go ahead and put a link to it in the chat at some point?
I'll see. Yeah, I'm not the smartest guy with technology, but I'll do the best.
All right.
I can.
If anybody else can do it, if you could do that, would appreciate that. Go ahead, David.
Okay, and also I just would like to make a comment where he's referencing, the little child, because it's something that Jesus references many, many times throughout the scriptures. And the thing is, to me, one thing I've learned is that after you become aware of the Spirit of God, the thing is, I actually go to Jesus and learn as a child without taking the garbage that I had in my mind before that caused me to take and, have need for repentance and have need to learning from Jesus Christ. So when he's talking about coming to him as a little child, he's just talking about, hey, you got to look at all of his things that he is saying to you in a fresh new way. Because if you bring the old baggage, you're going to take and still have the old baggage when you take on the new stuff,
Thank you.
That's it. So somebody put that in there. That's good.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Margarita, followed by Brian. Margarita.
Yeah, actually, I have a question, but thank you, Jeff. I think it's related to my question. You already explained that. And it's interesting that some translations say the change of heart or change or being born again into that particular thing that you say. But I was wondering from this verse 10 to 13, why would human deny lights if we are a part of God, made in accordance to God's? Why we reject light?
Okay.
Even there's also a different story in the chapter 6, I think. Even after Jesus did his teaching, some left away. I mean, some just say that it's just too difficult. I leave you. So why we do that? Yeah, that's my question.
Evanik, you had an answer?
Yeah, well, it's an attempt at an answer. So I think one of the things that what does light do, right? It shines light on things that maybe are not, that do not want to be seen by people. So, for example, like one of the things that Jesus did is that he shone a light on what the Pharisees were doing in the dark and how they were misleading people. And he tells them, you put a yoke on your people that you yourselves do not bear. Some people, like the Samaritan woman or, the adulterous woman, really wanted the light and they really wanted a different life for themselves. But some people just get comfortable and they don't want to change. So I think when you say they don't want to receive the light, because then if they receive the light, then they're forced to change something. They don't want to change. And I think that's the commonality of human being. A lot of people don't want to change. So I think that's part of the answer.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Pegor, followed by Carl. Pegor.
Is my voice okay?
Yes, better,
Okay.
much better.
Okay. The reason, well, first of all, I would argue it's because we have free choice, free will. So we can choose to turn away from the light and from God. And so it's even in the book of Revelation where once the final judgment, people can still choose. It's like on the day of judgment, God will reveal himself like fully in all his like glory or whatever. And even in that moment, you can still choose to turn away. And because God can't make you sort of understand what he's about. And so if you choose to turn away, you can choose to turn away.
Thank you. Next up is Carl.
Just also responding to the question is why, if we are...
Carl, you are very faint.
Okay, here we are.
Yep.
Just responding again to the question of why, if we are made by God, that how we would be, why we would not want to know about him. I think that there's a really elegant story about that in early Genesis about the story of the fall. And Shrikant, I think that'd be really fascinating story for you to investigate if you're investigating John. But it basically talks about a bifurcation of humans into
to 14 through 18. Joe, could you read it?
Yes, sure. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known.
Wow. All right. So I'm going to read it one more time, just to, because this is just covers so much. And anybody who wants to talk about it, and we will, this is the last thing we are going to discuss, but let's take time to discuss this. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." Wow. All right. Comments, thoughts? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. David, go ahead.
Oh,
yes. David Norton. You're on mute, though. David, you're on mute.
sorry about that. Okay, when it says, when it begins, and the Word was made flesh, to me, you have to go back to the last section when it's talking about which were born not of blood, nor of will or flesh, nor of man, but of God. The thing is that spirit has to be born within a person, and it becomes a part of a person's flesh, because you no longer operate in the world in which you did before. Just like the only thing to do is use an example of myself. when I became aware of the power of God, okay, before that, I used to take and say GD and Jesus Christ and all these different things. But then all of a sudden, I realized that what I was doing is through those words, I was creating a life that when I used the word GD, I was asking God to condemn my life. And the thing is, my life was miserable because of the words that I was actually using in my life. Okay, but the thing is, once God became alive, which was when the word became flesh inside of me and my flesh, then I became aware of all these different things. And then I started to take and turn to Jesus to learn what the truth of life is actually about. And the thing is, and then he taught me. And the thing is, you get down to the part where it says, for the law given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. The law was given by Moses, and Moses is tied very much into the words of Jesus Christ, because the thing is, Jesus Christ actually completes the law. He takes each one of the commandments and he adds to it and gives a further understanding to each one of the commandments that Moses gives. And this is all located in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7. So, you know, to me, this whole thing says a whole lot, and this is just one simple idea that I'm sharing, and there's many other ideas that come to mind in seeing this, and I know everybody has their own too, which will be reflected here.
Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Joe. Brian.
Yes, again, I agree with what David has said. And to me, that this is an example of how the, as reflected in this gospel here, the Christian tradition can really be a full introduction or invitation to life, really complete in itself. So in that way, tying in with what Jason said earlier, and also Shrikant followed up, it is a universal religion. It's also available to everyone. It's not like Jason said, it's not a tribal religion. But I think it does bear mentioning it's not universal in one way, and that is that Christianity claims that Jesus is the only way to have this full life. It's not just one of the ways. It says Jesus is the light, not a light. And I think there are other lights. For example, with Michael's talk, which I thought really showed how Buddhist tradition is very consistent in many ways with Christian tradition and Christian teachings. I think his insights were drawn from the Buddhist tradition. And I think that those can be as insightful and as much an invitation to life and light as the Christian.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Joe.
So, I mean, I'm going to go off a little bit here and try and pull from it what else can be extracted from these two paragraphs. It's that not only that what is true and that the word became flesh, and all those that has already been commented upon, but we're also being rescued from something, right? We have to be rescued from something in order for God to have made himself man. Like that is, so there's this element of that, God's not only truth, but he's the way, because you don't want to go the other way, which is hell, is essentially that you can infer from there. Because if you feel like if you're going away from God, or if you're going away from Christ, that you're not following Christ. So it's just as if you were to say in Taoism, I don't believe in the way, I believe in my way. That you're going against nature versus with nature. So this is a really important point, because once you're saying that, then it's an acceptance of everything that comes there from Christianity. That's just That's just it's a different perspective. I know it. I just didn't want to repeat everybody.
Yeah. No, I think this is huge, and I was blown away by this, saying that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, or it is word and flesh, word in flesh. So you have both, and the crucial role is of that Jesus is an intermediary. That you can't see God directly. You can see God through Jesus, because Jesus is a man, and you can relate to him as a man, and he is a God. And so in that, so it is the intermediary, it is the thing that it is that which connects you, connects the real and the ideal together in one, because it is both at the same time. Next up is David.
Okay, back on again. I just want to take in, mention, I hear these, once again, different things that, other people, like as far as I'm concerned, like the Buddha and Confucius. I mean, there have been many people in the past and also ideologies that also reflect the same truths of Jesus Christ. And, the thing is, Jesus was, the way I look at it, brought up in a Greek culture. And a lot of times Christianity takes and pushes the Greek culture aside and tries to divorce it. But the thing is, the Odyssey and a lot of Homer's writings and things that he did tell stories, and they give definition of words in a story. And the thing is, when that is given, sometimes there's far more insight into understanding when you have a story about a word and you can actually picture that in your own mind and then relate it as they do into some of the stories that they do. Now, also, because of that, I believe that Jesus uses a lot of his parables and stories that are very similar to a lot of the Greek mythological stories as well. And I think he does, well, to me, does a beautiful job. Nobody's ever done a better job than he's done of it. And I just like to say that, and that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Joe.
I just want to second the idea of what you just said, because I think that that's maybe the most profound point for me this evening, is that it's the real. It takes God and it makes something real, and it creates the ideal. So it creates truth.
Yes.
So it's this concrete and I mean, and actually, I hate to mention it's in the design way too. But I mean, but this idea,
it's the same. Yeah, it's
it's the same concept though. It's the same concept. What is the ideal, and then what is concrete, and what is real? And I think that that's once you communicate that, then you have a place where everybody can then aim, and that is the way to be. That's how you achieve paradise or whatever, however you're going to say it. But that is a profound concept to introduce to the world in human terms.
Yes.
That's something that is like something that you can almost, and the idea of the imagination that creates that, it's the hero. It's the hero's journey as well. That was really well said.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's basically, it is real, true, and ideal at once. It is the ultimate particular. It's the same, it's the same concept, and it's profoundly human. See, Jesus is profoundly human. You see his entire reaction and how he operates. It's profoundly human. At the same time, he is God at the same time. And what that does is that it provides an ideal, not an abstracted ideal, which is unreachable, but it's an ideal that is available to you at any point, and you just have to open your heart and accept it. Next up is Brian.
Yes, I agree with what whatever, endorse or agree. I think Shrikant really crystallized the thought I was having, and what two parts of it. Number one is it's not just what Jesus said, it was his life, he lived these things.
Yes.
And but that can't be the end of the story in the way Shrikant presented it. And that's through something that's not really in this text right now, but it's the Holy, what other people have flagged, the Holy Spirit, the word that is spread. And there are other gospels, it's been in the chat, they've flagged this, that others can be Christ or others can be Jesus by following the word. So they can also instantiate, that we've used that word in our meetups a lot, in their own lives as well, just as Jesus did. And that's what makes it, it's not just the word, it's the living that makes it important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the rest of the gospel is about Jesus showing people how to do that, first to his disciples, and then encouraging them to show it to other people. So what he's the intermediary. And then ultimately you have the Holy Spirit, which is your connection to God when Jesus is gone. So it's a whole, I mean, I love the entire, this gospel. And the thing I like about the gospel is its poetical power, how clear it is, how direct it is, how simple it is, and how, so it's amazing. So folks, okay, Jason, you had something, go ahead.
Real quick, Shrikant, I think you've been everyone's putting things very well, but one thing you said, Shrikant, is the ideal and the real, and it made me think back to something someone had said a long time ago, is that it's a call to, it's the sacred coming down to our lives, but also the expectation that our whole lives can be wrapped up in the sacred as well, that everything we do in this life, just as everything Jesus did in his life, short life, it was with the sacred in mind. It was that even the most mundane aspects of our life can be seen in an overall story of what's right, what's good, and what's sacred. And that even though our bodies may be broken, and ultimately we will all be broken, right? We're only temporarily able-bodied. We will all be disabled at some time or another. But though our bodies be, even in their best condition, still flawed, right? But ultimately be very flawed, we can still, in our daily practices, starting when we're young, find ways to bring forth the sacred the way Jesus did 2,000 years ago, in the same flesh, with the same limitations, as a limitless God, voluntarily taking on limitations just to show us flawed, limited humans that that this flesh is still worthy of housing the sacred for as many years as Jesus lived on this earth, and even today, as we can still house those sacred values. So
beautifully put. Thank you. So folks, this has been just amazing. I think, what we are doing with Tao Te Ching inspired me to start this. And I think we are doing the same thing. We are achieving the same kind of results with this text as we are doing with Tao Te Ching. And I look forward to adding Bhagavad Gita to the mix so that we can look at all these three in parallel. We will focus, we have to first focus on the text itself and try to understand it as best as we can. It is difficult. I'm not from this tradition, so it is completely new to me. Now, I have some really good friends. This, much of what I'm saying is thanks to a friend who spent 10 hours, we going back and forth on this piece so that I could learn something. And the same experience I'm having with all of you folks, bringing out the entire richness, the entire context of this work. And so I'm really honored and really grateful to everybody who is adding to this dialogue. So thank you so much. What we're going to do is that we're going to continue this 2 weeks from now. I'm traveling next week, so I can't do this next week. But 2 weeks from now, we'll pick this up. And so we'll keep on doing this every other Friday. And then from 3 weeks from today, I'm going to start with Bhagavad Gita. And I'm going to have some people do introduction to it first. And then we will go through it chapter by chapter, just like we are going through Tao Te Ching and the Bible. So thank you very much, everybody. Good night.